That is not a spiritual quote, that is not motivation. That is the most demanding sentence ever written about what it costs a man to become who he was made to be. Because becoming who you truly are is not comfortable, it is not celebrated, it does not happen in the light. It happens in the exact darkness you have been trying to escape. And God has been waiting in that darkness the entire time. There is a specific kind of man watching this right now, not a weak man, not a man who has given up. A man who is in the middle of something he cannot name, something that feels like punishment but does not quite fit the definition. Something that feels like failure but does not match the evidence. He has been doing the right things, praying, grinding, showing up. And yet the doors remain closed. The recognition has not come. The breakthrough he was promised seems further away today than it did a year ago. He is starting to wonder if God has forgotten him. He has not been forgotten, he has been chosen, and chosen men do not get promoted first. They get tested first, broken first, rebuilt first. The promotion comes last, always last. Because God does not hand authority to men who have not yet proven they can carry it without being destroyed by it. What is happening to you right now is not abandonment, it is architecture. And by the time this video ends, you will understand exactly what is being built and why it could not have been built any other way. Every man who has ever been trusted by God has first passed through what Jung called the negrido, the darkening. The stage of transformation in which everything false must be burned away before anything true can emerge. The alchemists called it the blackening of the soul, not because the soul becomes evil, because it becomes honest, stripped of performance, stripped of pretension, stripped of every layer that was built for the world rather than for God. Jung was not a preacher, he was a scientist. But what he discovered in 60 years of mapping the human psyche aligns with what every prophet, every patriarch, every man chosen by God has lived through since the beginning of recorded time. The breaking is not accidental, the stripping is not random. The silence is not punishment. It is preparation. And the precision of what God removes from a man before he trusts him with power is the same precision Jung identified in the psychology of genuine transformation. He does not remove what is weak, he removes what is false, he does not destroy what is broken. He destroys what was never real to begin with, the mask, the performance, the carefully constructed identity built on approval and applause, and the validation of men who will not be there when the real test arrives. God is not breaking you, he is breaking what was never you. David did not become king in the palace, he became king in the wilderness. In the years nobody watched, in the years nobody cheered. In the years he ran from Saul through desert and cave, and isolation so complete that lesser men would have concluded God had abandoned the promise entirely. But the wilderness was not the interruption of David's destiny, the wilderness was the construction of it. Every year in the desert was a year God was building something in David that the palace could not build: humility, patience, the capacity to lead without ego, the ability to carry power without being consumed by it, the understanding that the throne he was anointed for was not about his glory. It was about God's purpose, moving through a man disciplined enough to be its vessel. Jung would call what happened to David in the wilderness the death of the false self. The constructed identity, the shepherd boy who needed to prove himself, the young man drunk on his own anointing. The soldier intoxicated by his own victories had to die in that desert, had to be stripped away by years of silence and suffering and the complete absence of external validation. So that what emerged from the wilderness was not the man David wanted to become, it was the man God needed him to be. The wilderness is not where God forgets you, it is where God finishes you. Here is the psychological truth beneath the spiritual reality. And it is uncomfortable in the precise way that true things are uncomfortable. Most men who pray for God's trust are not ready for it. Not because they are bad men, because they are unexamined men. Men who have never sat with their own shadow, the part of themselves Jung identified as containing everything denied, suppressed, unacknowledged, and asked what is actually living in there. What drives me that I have not admitted? What controls me that I have not confronted? What weakness am I performing as strength? What fear am I disguising as faith? God cannot trust a man who does not know himself. Because a man who does not know himself cannot be trusted with power without being destroyed by it. The moment success arrives, the unexamined man becomes something dangerous, pride masquerading as confidence, control masquerading as leadership, ego masquerading as anointing. He becomes the very thing he was called to stand against. This is why the fire comes first, not to punish the man, to expose him, to show him every place where what he built was constructed on ground that cannot hold what God intends to place on it. The rejection is not random, it lands exactly where the foundation is weak. The betrayal is not accidental. It arrives at exactly the relationship where the man's worth was most dangerously dependent on another person's approval. The delay is not arbitrary. It comes at exactly the moment when the man's faith was still more about what God could give him than about who God is. God is not cruel. He is precise, and his precision in the breaking is the most loving thing he will ever do for a man he has chosen. There was a man who spent 7 years believing he was being prepared for something great. He prayed consistently, he disciplined his body. He served faithfully in every assignment he was given regardless of its size or visibility, and for 7 years nothing happened, no promotion, no recognition, no open door that matched the size of the vision he carried. The people around him moved forward, built businesses, started families, accumulated the markers of success that he had been promised and not yet received. He did not quit, but he began to perform his faithfulness rather than live it. He began to pray with words that sounded like surrender but carried the weight of demand. He served with actions that looked like humility but were secretly auditions for the recognition he had not received. He was faithful on the outside. He was furious on the inside, and he told nobody, because a man of God is not supposed to be furious. The fury was not his enemy. The fury was information. Jung would say the fury was the shadow speaking, carrying the truth the man's conscious performance of faithfulness was refusing to acknowledge. That he had been serving God as a transaction rather than a transformation. That his discipline was impressive, but his motives were still contaminated by a need to be seen that he had never honestly confronted. That the 7 years of waiting had not yet produced what God was waiting for, not because God had not noticed his faithfulness, but because God was waiting for his honesty. The moment the man stopped performing surrender and actually surrendered, not as a strategy for finally receiving the breakthrough, but as a genuine release of every claim he had been making on God's timeline. Everything changed, not overnight, not dramatically, but in the direction of a man who was finally, genuinely, ready to be trusted with what he had been promised. God was not waiting for his perfection. He was waiting for his honesty. He is waiting for yours. Jung identified what he called the process of individuation as the central task of a human life. The movement away from the constructed self, the self built from external expectations, cultural conditioning, and survival strategies, toward the authentic self that God placed inside you before the world began shaping you into something more manageable. This process is not comfortable. Jung was absolutely clear about this. It requires the direct confrontation of everything you have been avoiding. Every weakness you have been performing as strength, every fear you have been disguising as faith. Every need you have been pretending does not exist because needing things felt incompatible with the image of a man of God you were trying to project. The man God trusts is not the man who has eliminated his weakness. He is the man who has looked at his weakness with complete honesty and stopped pretending it is not there. Because only a man who knows exactly where he is weak can be trusted not to let that weakness destroy what God places in his hands. Only a man who has sat with his own shadow and named what lives in there can be trusted to lead others without projecting his unexamined darkness onto them. God does not anoint the man with the best performance, he anoints the man with the most honest self-knowledge. Because that man is the only one who can carry power without being corrupted by it. The only one who can be elevated without losing his soul in the elevation. Joseph spent 13 years in conditions that had no logical connection to the destiny God had shown him in dreams as a boy. Slavery, false accusation, prison, the specific cruelty of a promise that seemed to grow more impossible with every passing year. Every external circumstance screamed that the dream was dead, that God had either forgotten or never meant it. That the man Joseph was becoming in prison was not the man who would stand before Pharaoh. But the man Joseph was becoming in prison was precisely the man who could stand before Pharaoh. Because prison stripped from Joseph everything that would have made him dangerous with power, the arrogance of the favored son, the need to be seen that had caused him to parade his dreams before his brothers without wisdom or restraint, the naivety of a young man who had been given a vision of greatness without yet understanding what greatness actually costs. What emerged from 13 years of suffering was not a broken man, it was a finished one. A man who had been so thoroughly stripped of every false thing that what remained was pure, uncontaminated by ego, uncompromised by the need for recognition, completely aligned with a purpose larger than himself. A man God could finally trust with the second most powerful position in the known world. Because Joseph in his father's house with his coat of many colors would have been destroyed by that power. Joseph, after 13 years of the fire, was ready for it. The years you have spent in your version of the pit were not wasted, they were investment. God was not punishing you in that pit. He was protecting the world from who you would have become if he had trusted you with power before the fire finished its work. Here is what the becoming actually looks like, not from the outside, from the inside. Where no one sees and no one cheers, and the only audience is God and your own conscience. It looks like choosing discipline on the day when every emotion in you is screaming for release. Not because discipline feels meaningful in that moment, because you have decided that your habits are your prayer. That what you do when no one is watching is the truest version of your conversation with God. That consistency in the dark is the only currency heaven accepts. It looks like sitting with your own darkness, your lust, your pride, your need for validation, your secret resentments, without immediately suppressing them or immediately indulging them, but examining them, asking what they are carrying. What legitimate need lives beneath the illegitimate expression? What God is trying to show you about yourself through the very thing that most shames you? Because the shadow Jung identified is not separate from your spiritual life, it is the primary territory of your spiritual formation. A man cannot be transformed by God while simultaneously refusing to look at what God is trying to show him about himself. It looks like releasing the timeline, not performing release, actually releasing, the demand disguised as prayer, the ultimatum disguised as faith. The negotiation with God that presents itself as surrender, but is actually a different form of control. True release is not saying, Lord, your timing is perfect, while secretly believing the timing is wrong. True release is reaching the place where you genuinely do not know when and genuinely trust who. That place cannot be performed. It can only be arrived at through the specific suffering that burns the performance away. It looks like becoming a man whose word is law to himself before he asks God to make it law to others. Who conquers his own impulses before he asks to be trusted with influence over other people's lives. Who deals honestly with his own ego before he is given the opportunity to shape the culture of a room. Leadership begins in private. Authority is established in solitude. The man God trusts is being built in the hidden place long before he is revealed in the public one. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness of Midian before God spoke from the burning bush. 40 years after growing up in Pharaoh's palace. After carrying the knowledge of his identity as a Hebrew man. After the impulsive act of violence that ended his Egyptian life in an instant. 40 years of shepherding sheep in obscurity while his people suffered in slavery, and the destiny God had placed on his life appeared to have been permanently derailed by one moment of uncontrolled anger. The 40 years were not a pause in Moses' destiny. They were the most important part of it. Because the man who stepped out of Pharaoh's palace, powerful, educated, passionate, and completely unbroken, was not capable of leading 2 million people through a wilderness for 40 years. He was capable of starting revolutions. He was not capable of sustaining transformation. The fire of Midian burned out of Moses everything that would have made him a revolutionary leader who produced momentary change, and built in its place a man of God who could carry a nation through 40 years of difficulty without losing his mind, his faith, or his people. Jung called this the transition from the first half of life to the second. The first half is about building, constructing the self, acquiring power, identity, and position. The second half is about becoming, stripping away everything that was built for the wrong reasons, and arriving at the authentic self that can carry true purpose without being destroyed by it. Midian was Moses's second half, the pit was Joseph's. The wilderness was David's, the prison was Paul's. What is yours because you have one? And the fact that you are in it is not evidence that God has abandoned your destiny. It is evidence that your destiny is large enough to require this level of preparation. You came to this video carrying something specific. The weight of a man who knows he was made for more and cannot understand why the more has not arrived. The frustration of faithfulness that has not yet been rewarded by the outcomes you expected. The quiet crisis of a man whose belief in his calling is beginning to be tested by the extended silence of the one who gave him the calling. Jung is not telling you something different from what God is telling you. He is telling you the same thing from a different direction. The breaking is necessary, the silence is purposeful, the suffering is not random. It is targeted, aimed precisely at every place in you where what was built on ground that cannot hold what God is preparing to place on your life. You are not being punished, you are being trusted with the process, and the process is the most sacred thing God will ever give you. Because the destination without the process produces men who cannot handle what they receive. The process without the destination produces men who cannot endure what they are asked to carry. But the man who has walked all the way through the process, who has been broken and examined and stripped and rebuilt and refined in the fire until every false thing is gone and what remains is purely and completely what God placed inside him before the world had any say in the matter, that man is ready for anything, for everything. That man is not the man you were when this video started, but he is the man you are becoming, in the silence, in the suffering, in the grinding unseen consistency of a life lived in honest alignment with a God who sees every moment the world misses. He is not finished with you, he has not forgotten you, he has not abandoned the promise. He is simply doing what he has always done with the men he has chosen. He is building something the world will not be able to ignore when he finally reveals it. And he is taking exactly as long as it takes. Because what he is building in you is not for a season, it is for eternity, and eternal things are not rushed, they are refined. Again and again and again, until what remains is not what you wanted to become, but what he always knew you were.